Friday, November 7th, 2025, AGNDD Intelli Report topic. The true story behind Nuremberg Woe. Drama about Hermann Göring cat and mouse game with an American psychiatrist. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this entirely AI-generated article-based video. The true story behind Nuremberg, a WWII drama about Hermann Göring's cat and mouse game with an American psychiatrist. Starring Russell Crowe as the high-ranking Nazi and Rami Malek as Army Officer Douglas M. Kelly, the film dramatizes the intense dynamic between its central characters during the Nuremberg trials. Smithsonian Magazine, smithsonianmag.com/history/Melan Sali, Senior Associate Digital Editor, History, November 7, 2025, 7 a.m. In late 1945, Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking member of the surviving Nazi leadership, made an extraordinary request. On trial for his crimes during World War II, Göring considered his family's future. Would Lieutenant Colonel Douglas M. Kelly, the United States Army doctor assigned to evaluate him as part of the famed Nuremberg trials, promise to adopt Göring's young daughter Edda and raise her in the U.S. if both he and his wife died? Was this a genuine request? Or simply the latest in a series of manipulative appeals to Kelly's humanity? Ethical, political, and personal considerations almost certainly led the psychiatrist to turn his patient down. But the fact that Göring voiced it in the first place speaks to the pair's highly unusual relationship. The two men were like King Kong versus Godzilla, says Jack L. High, author of The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, Hermann Göring, Dr. Douglas M. Kelly, and A Fatal Meeting of Minds at the End of Wood II. They were both master manipulators and doing everything they could to get what they wanted from the other. They did not become friends, but they became two people who spent a lot of time together, who had a connection. They understood each other in a sense. L. High's 2013 book forms the basis of Nuremberg, a new film starring Russell Crowe as Göring and Rami Malek as Kelly. Written and directed by James Vanderbilt, the movie dramatizes Kelly's quest to dissect evil, as Malek says in the movie, by determining whether members of the Nazi high command shared a psychiatric condition that led them to commit unspeakable atrocities, the Holocaust chief among them. Crowe's Göring, meanwhile, uses his meetings with Kelly as a dress rehearsal for the rousing defense of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party that he plans to deliver on the stand. As Michael Berenbaum, a scholar who served as Nuremberg's historical consultant, says, "For Göring, this was an intellectual game. Can I outmanipulate my captors and, in that sense, dominate?" Nuremberg places its central character's cat and mouse game against the backdrop of a defining moment in modern times. Horrified by irrefutable evidence of mass murder across a network of more than 44,000 Nazi death and concentration camps, the Allies sought to hold individual leaders of a combatant country accountable for crimes against humanity. The first of their kind proceedings offered a once-in-a-lifetime chance to examine men considered some of the worst criminals of the century all together in one place, L. High says. They also set a precedent that continues to shape international law today. The trials were not only a response to unspeakable crimes, but also the beginning of a global commitment to criminal justice, said Jens Hannefeld, the German ambassador to the U.S., at an October 30th screening of Nuremberg in Washington, D.C. Here's what you need to know about the real history behind Nuremberg as the film arrives in theaters across the United States on November 7th. Bringing the Nazi and the psychiatrist to the screen. L. High first learned Kelly's name while researching his book about a lobotomist who'd encountered Kelly at a psychiatry conference before the war. Rather than presenting a paper or a scholarly talk, Kelly performed a magic show for his colleagues. Intrigued, L. High set out to learn more about the psychiatrist, but was unable to find Kelly's papers in any archives or libraries. The author contacted Kelly's oldest son, Doug Kelly, who invited him to visit his home in California and look through the documents his father had left behind. When I got to Doug's house, he led me into the living room where he had dragged up 15 boxes, banker's boxes, of his father's materials that he had brought home from Nuremberg, Elhai recalls. Much of this was stuff that Dr. Kelly should not have brought back, because it belonged, at least back in 1946, to the U.S. government and to the International Military Tribunal. But there it was in Doug Kelly's living room. Kelly's papers contained in-depth medical assessments of the nearly 24 defendants prosecuted in the first Nuremberg trial. The boxes also held physical artifacts, including a vial of paracodeine pills confiscated from Göring and a packet of biscuits refused by Rudolf Hess, the former deputy Führer, not to be confused with Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, because he believed the Allies were trying to poison him. Building on this trove of previously unseen materials, Elhai crafted a sweeping narrative that shed light on a long-overlooked figure in the Nuremberg trials. Vanderbilt, who previously wrote the screenplays for Zodiac and The Amazing Spider-Man, read Elhai's work early on and was immediately hooked. As the director and writer tells The Hollywood Reporter, "I started writing the very first draft 13 years ago, and it took me probably a solid year of research just because I wanted to be as accurate as possible." Reflecting on his involvement in Nuremberg, Barenbaum says, "I am sometimes approached to clean up stuff after there are questions, but this was from inception, and that gave me a wonderful opportunity to influence the creation of the film." Psychiatric assessments of the Nuremberg defendants. Nuremberg begins with Göring's capture and imprisonment by the U.S. Army in May 1945. Hitler's chosen successor, at least until he tried to assume power prematurely, Göring was the second most powerful politician in the Third Reich, tasked with overseeing the German Air Force and the creation of the Gestapo, the Nazis' secret police. Though Göring fell out of favor as World War II raged on, the suicides of Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and other leading Germans in the final days of the war made the Reichsmarschall, a military rank created specifically for Göring, the most visible remaining figurehead of the Nazi regime. A parallel narrative in the first part of the film follows Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, played by Michael Shannon, as he drums up support for a public trial of the surviving Nazi high command. While Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wanted to stage a show trial for Göring and his collaborators, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill supported simply executing the Germans without due process. It was the Americans, under Jackson's direction, who pushed for a public trial that melded Soviet procedural processes, British common law, French Napoleonic Code, and American constitutional law. Each of the four Allied powers supplied a team of prosecutors and a judge. To convict defendants, a majority of the four judges had to agree on the verdict and sentence. "If we just shoot these men, we make them martyrs," says Jackson, who served as the Americans' chief prosecutor in the film. "I'm not going to let that happen." In Nuremberg, Malix Kelly arrives on the scene with little grasp of the massive scope of the task ahead of him. A 32-year-old Army officer who'd treated thousands of shell-shocked soldiers on the Western Front, the psychiatrist didn't seek out the assignment that awaited him in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, the site of a luxury hotel-turned-Allied interrogation center. Upon arriving at Mondorf in early August 1945, Kelly learned that the Army wanted him to evaluate the defendants and judge whether they were fit to stand trial from a psychological standpoint, Elhai says. Did they know right from wrong? Were they in control of their behavior? The Allies were particularly concerned about Hess, who veered between claiming that he was suffering from amnesia and then saying that he was faking his memory loss. Kelly later wrote, "If one considers the street as sanity and the sidewalk as insanity, then Hess spent the greater part of his time on the curb." Deciding whether a defendant was a suicide risk or incapable of understanding the consequences of their actions was an easy task for a psychiatrist like Kelly, and he wanted a bigger challenge for himself, Elhai says. Both Kelly and Gustav Gilbert, Colin Hanks, a psychologist brought in a few months later to provide another opinion on the defendants, viewed their work as an opportunity to answer key questions about human nature. "We must learn the why of the Nazi success so we can take steps to prevent the recurrence of such evil," Kelly wrote in the manuscript for his 1947 book about the trials, 22 Cells in Nuremberg. Assisted by translators, among them German Jewish refugee Howie Triest, Leo Woodall, the doctors administered Rorschach inkblot tests to the prisoners and spent hours with the Nazi officials in their cells, talking about their motivations, what was important to them, and other common questions a mental health professional might discuss with their patients, Elhai says. Besides Göring and Hess, the prisoners included Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, Julius Streicher, the editor-in-chief of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, and architect Albert Speer, who earned Kelly's dislike for claiming to have known nothing about the Holocaust. Kelly developed a particularly close relationship with Göring, whom he described as an aggressive, narcissistic individual. According to the psychiatrist, there were people and things that he liked, his family, his friends and animals, and for them, nothing was too good. On the other hand, he had a complete and total disinterest in any living thing which did not fall into one of these groups. To win over Göring, the enormously confident, perhaps overconfident Kelly broke the army's rules and established a relationship with the Nazis' wife and daughter, passing letters back and forth between the separated family members, says Barenbaum. First in Mondorf and then in Nuremberg, where Göring and the other Nazis were moved in mid-August, the prisoners lived under harsh conditions imposed by Colonel Burton C. Andrus, John Slattery. Guards rummaged through the Germans' sparse belongings at will, on the lookout for anything that could be used to commit suicide. They shined flashlights into the cells at night to ensure compliance with a rule that inmates' heads and hands be visible at all times, even when sleeping. Despite these measures, Ley managed to fashion a noose out of a towel and strangle himself while sitting on the toilet, just out of view of a guard. Such a death is both slow and painful, Kelly wrote. It demonstrates Ley's violent will to die. Though Göring regarded suicide as a logical choice when honor and national dignity came under attack, wrote Elhai in The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, he didn't intend to kill himself before seizing the opportunity to speak out in his defense on the world stage. Far from admitting wrongdoing during his sessions with Kelly, Göring maintained that the Nuremberg trials were simply the result of the Germans having lost and the Allies having won, that it had nothing to do with the moral superiority of one side over the other, Elhai says. The Nuremberg trials. Just 6 months after the end of the war in Europe, the first Nuremberg trial began on November 20, 1945. The Allied-led International Military Tribunal charged the 22 defendants with 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Nearly 400 visitors, including reporters, military personnel, victims' families, and assorted members of the public, sat in the gallery each day, following the proceedings in person, as those further afield read about them in newspapers, listened in on the radio, or caught up on key moments via newsreels. In his opening statement, Jackson declared that the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. The Supreme Court Justice emphasized the historic nature of the proceedings, acknowledging that the men were the first war leaders of a defeated nation to be prosecuted in the name of the law, but also the first to be given a chance to plead for their lives in the name of the law, an opportunity never afforded to the 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. A critical moment in the trial arrived during its second week, on November 29th, when prosecutors played footage recorded by the Allied troops who'd liberated Nazi concentration camps. At a time when most members of the public had only read about these atrocities, the images of skeletal survivors and piles of nude corpses proved shocking to many in the courtroom. Even the men on trial seemed disturbed. According to the Nazi and the Psychiatrist, Göring coughed nervously and covered his face with his right arm, while several others cried or averted their gaze. All the defendants were obviously affected, and the majority felt a profound shame at what they realized was Germany's disgrace before the world, the press reported, attributing the assessment to both Kelly and Gilbert. Berenbaum, however, says his research suggests the film chilled the souls of those who saw it, the prosecution, the judgment, the press, and the audience, but less so the perpetrators and their defense. Nuremberg recreates this scene, showing the actual historical footage as seen through the eyes of the movie's characters. Malix Kelly is most affected by the screening. He abruptly leaves the courtroom, then confronts Göring about his role in the camps. The pair drop any pretense of friendship and throw accusations of hypocrisy at each other, leaving Kelly so upset that he drunkenly spills trial secrets to a reporter and is summarily discharged from the army. The real circumstances of Kelly's departure from Nuremberg were less dramatic. After spending 3 years away from his wife, the psychiatrist was eager to return to the U.S. and start writing a book about his experiences. Though he and Gilbert had initially agreed to co-author a volume on the Nuremberg defendants, Kelly reneged on this plan after arriving back home. Many of the prisoners expressed their thanks to Kelly for his care during their imprisonment. Göring reportedly broke down and wept upon learning that Kelly was leaving the prison, Elhai wrote in The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. Nuremberg's climax arrives during Jackson's cross-examination of Göring, which took place in March 1946, but in Vanderbilt's film unfolds shortly after Kelly's discharge from the army. Jackson confronts Göring with a document bearing his signature as evidence that he personally authorized the final solution, as the Nazis euphemistically referred to the mass murder of Europe's Jews. Göring's defense that the document has been mistranslated and actually states for a total solution leaves Jackson at a loss for words. It is only the intervention of British prosecutor David Maxwell Fyfe, Richard E. Grant, who tricks Göring into saying that he would still follow Hitler despite what he knows now, that manages to save the trial from becoming the Reichsmarschall's personal platform for Nazi propaganda. The film version of Fyfe makes it clear who should claim credit for the victory. Göring cannot stand against the Führer, Fyfe says, repeating an insight previously shared by Kelly. Invaluable information, Doctor, the prosecutor adds. In actuality, Kelly had no role in the trial after his departure from Nuremberg, and his influence in the early months of the proceedings was more limited than suggested in the movie. The specifics of Göring's downfall on the stand didn't play out exactly as seen on screen, but Berenbaum describes the film's portrayal of Jackson's stumbles in his initial face-off with the Nazi as historically accurate. This misstep by the prosecution is not something that an American audience necessarily wants to see, he says, but the filmmakers remain faithful and truthful to the real history of the trial. The International Military Tribunal delivered its verdicts on September 30th and October 1st, 1946, condemning 12 defendants, including Göring, to death by hanging, 3 to life imprisonment, and 4 to lengthy prison terms. 3 defendants were found not guilty. After his request to be shot by a firing squad was denied, Göring poisoned himself with cyanide just a few hours before his scheduled execution. In 2005, an American prison guard claimed that he'd smuggled the cyanide pill to Göring at the behest of a local girl. Another leading theory pins the blame on a different guard. In a statement to the press, Jackson criticized Göring's suicide as cowardly, saying, "When he took his own life, he killed the myth of Nazi bravery and stoicism and deep conviction." Kelly, on the other hand, adopted a more sympathetic tone in his book, writing, "His suicide, shrouded in mystery and emphasizing the impotency of the American guards, was a skillful, even brilliant finishing touch, completing the edifice for Germans to admire in time to come." The legacy of the Nuremberg trials and Kelly's research. In the aftermath of the Nuremberg trials, Kelly pored over his research notes and came to a perhaps surprising conclusion. He believed the defendants were not exceptional, Elhai says. They were not deviant humans. They were not monsters. They all fell within the normal range, psychiatrically speaking. While Kelly had set out to find a common link between the high-ranking Nazis, a psychological flaw that disposed them toward evil, He eventually found there was none, Elhai adds. Instead, Kelly argued that the defendants were simply opportunists, people who exist in every country of the world, as he said during a lecture in the fall of 1946, who would willingly climb over the corpses of half of the public if they could gain control of the other half. Kelly likened white supremacists in the U.S. to Hitler and his followers, emphasizing their use of racism as a method of obtaining power, political aggrandizement, or individual wealth. Without checks on the anti-democratic ideologies he'd witnessed in America, such as placing restrictions on voting rights and perpetuating anti-minority feeling, the psychiatrist believed that the U.S. could easily transform into a Nazi-like state. Kelly presented his findings in January 1947 in a book aimed at general audiences. His 22 cells in Nuremberg proved unpopular, with American readers objecting to the psychiatrist's attempts to draw parallels between Germany and their own country. When you say the perpetrators are like us and could be us, you're really giving a monumental insult to human nature, Berenbaum says. Evildoers may have been banal, as Kelly discovered, ordinary men who proved capable of doing extraordinary evil. Yet Göring was far from banal. He was the most talented of the defendants, the most daring, the most unrepentant, and the evil he enabled was the most absolute. The public was much more receptive to Gilbert's competing narrative, Nuremberg Diary, which had no qualms about diagnosing the defendants as narcissistic psychopaths whose lives were deformed by a diseased German culture, writes psychiatrist and historian Joel E. Dimsdale in Anatomy of Malice, The Enigma of the Nazi War Criminals. Gilbert's assessment was a much more pleasant explanation for what had occurred during the war, says Elhai, that these unusually horrible people were to blame, these monstrous people, and that we've defeated them and now things will be okay. Kelly's experiences at Nuremberg left him skeptical of the value of psychiatry. If it could not account for the behavior of men like this, what could? Elhai asks. Instead, he turned to criminology, a multidisciplinary field that he hoped could provide some more concrete answers. As a consultant with the local police department and a criminology professor at the University of California, Berkeley, Kelly worked on major cases such as the kidnapping and murder of 14-year-old Stephanie Bryan. He also appeared on television, presenting programs like The Criminal Man. Kelly's personal life, however, took a turn for the worse in the post-war years. His son Doug later recalled that his father was an alcoholic prone to mood swings and violent outbursts. On New Year's Day in 1958, Kelly burned himself while cooking, then ran into his study and returned to the living room where his family was gathered, with something tucked in the palm of his hand. After yelling out that he couldn't take this anymore, according to Doug, Kelly swallowed cyanide and fell to the floor. The 45-year-old was pronounced dead upon his arrival at the hospital. In its coverage of Kelly's suicide, the New York Times claimed that the psychiatrist had taken a pill confiscated from Göring and brought home from Nuremberg as a souvenir. While Elhai believes otherwise, noting that Kelly had an at-home laboratory that likely had cyanide on hand, he maintains that both men chose cyanide for the same reason. It was a dramatic way of making an exit, and a way of making a statement while making your exit. In Göring's case, it was, "You Americans will not control my destiny." For Kelly, the rationale might have been a final stand against a fate worse than death, a descent into incompetence in the face of his insecurities, responsibilities, and pressures, writes Elhai in The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. Regardless of the psychiatrist's reasoning for choosing the same suicide method as his most famous patient, Kelly's and Göring's names are now inextricably linked with both each other and one of the most consequential trials in world history. At the October 30th screening of Nuremberg, Berenbaum connected the International Military Tribunal's work to his time in Rwanda in the mid-1990s, when he advised the African nation's government how to document the Rwandan genocide so that history could not deny it. Berenbaum said, "I understood then the need to rebuild the scaffolding of justice, the need even to create the illusion of justice, Because if you don't create the illusion of justice, you don't have the capacity to renew society in its aftermath. The world returns again and again to the model of Nuremberg. Did you know? Judgment at Nuremberg. The most famous fictionalization of the Nuremberg trials is Judgment at Nuremberg, a 1961 film that focuses on proceedings against 16 German jurists and lawyers. The movie's characters are fictional, though some are based on real historical figures. Burt Lancaster's Ernst Janning, for example, was modeled on German judge Franz Schlegelberger, who served as the Third Reich's justice minister.
Thank you for watching this AGNDD Intelli report, dear viewers. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads. And make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.